that everything that we do, actually, if we take a second to rethink and learn from the experts, to have a mentor that can guide us, to relook at things, a great chance of relearning something.
When you talk about 7 months being loyalty, most HR and organization structures are not set up that way.
But if the smart nation is getting the hardware in place, which is a whole range of technologies, the software is the smart workforce.
Gentlemen, and thank you for joining us for our special conversation this morning, the HR and digital transformation, and especially how you can put that into practice in your workforce, in your workplace. You know, the question that often comes up is, what does the HR environment of the future look like? How do I attract and retain talent at a time of great disruption? How do I make sure that my customers are well looked after? And of course, how do we maximize the benefits that digital transformation will deliver to make businesses more efficient and more profitable? Let me start our conversation around how we engage the workforce of the future with inviting you to think back to the last time you went to a restaurant. Any restaurant. Was the restaurant automated in that they had an iPad and then you keyed in your order into the iPad? Has that been your experience? Yes, a few noddings. How many people here prefer to be served by a human waiter who waits on you hand and foot and then writes down your order? Okay, 1 or 2 hands still going up. Okay.
Old school.
Old school, perhaps. But frankly, that's not just the preference of, obviously, some people who go to restaurants, but might also be the preference of some of the staff who might be a little bit worried about the fact that they're being replaced by an iPad. And after all, they can now no longer just stand there silently and wait until you've decided whether it should be the beef or the chicken. But they now actually have to, seeing that they've already equipped you with an iPad, they now have to engage you in conversation and recommend the beef well done or the chicken au gratin. So the role for the wait staff in an F&B setting obviously has to change quite dramatically too. And what we're here to talk about perhaps is not so much the iPads, but what happens to the staff and how to make sure that when you are the boss or you're the one who's taking care of HR or talent roles in your company, that you're able to attract the best talent, retain them, and make sure that everybody comes away from the digital transformation a winner. Our panelists here today, please look them up on LinkedIn if you want to know their full biographies. President Asia Pacific at Workday, Mr. David Hope. Hold your applause. We also have Merle Chen from the Lo and Behold Group, where she's Chief Talent Officer. Ong Wee Tek, who runs his own company called Trusted Source. He's the Chief Executive. VP of Digital Marketing at MediaCorp, Miguel Bernas. And Wong Su Yen, who's at the Human Capital Leadership Institute and takes care of the development of the next generation of business leaders and managers in Asia. Let's start on the technology question. When we just strip away all of the HR aspects and the talent aspects from this restaurant analogy, how easy is it actually to implement something like iPad ordering?
Yeah, I may not be able to answer the iPad ordering, but HR technology is certainly getting easier to implement. I think if you think about the 10 years ago where you have to get your servers, you got to get the application configured, you got to get all your functional requirements written up, it takes a couple of years or 18 months or, you know, if you're really, really fortunate, 12 months to get something up and running. Today you can be up in a matter of 12, 18 weeks maybe, tops, right?
That still sounds quite long.
Yeah, you can go faster, depending on how standardized your processes are. But I think I just want to make one comment. I think it is never about technology. I think the people, process, technology alignment is key. You can get the technology implemented, but if your people are not ready, you're not going to be able to maximize it. You'll be falling back on old processes, then there's no benefits to it. So people, process, technology needs to be aligned, and you got to think through that. The second point is that these days, a lot of the change and transformation has to be owned by the business and owned by the top leadership. And I think that's key, because it's not bottom-driven solely. It has to be a joint top and bottom to get it going. So,
Merle, at your restaurants in the Lo and Behold Group, in how many of those places have you automated processes to some extent?
Actually, most of our restaurants are using the POS system. So I actually brought in an example. Well, we were the first one to implement the iPad ordering system at Louvre, which was our first rooftop bar. So, and interestingly with that, it created that sort of, while it enabled the process and that our employees don't actually have to run back and forth to take orders and then, get the check and all of that. But now they're standing by the table and they have to engage in conversations. So, we coined a term about passionate people creating awesome experience, but defining that awesome experience, defining that the guest experience, and how do you enable your employees to deliver on that guest experience has been the centerpiece for us. And we continually look at all the other corresponding HR technologies that will enable that sort of training and learning and development, so to speak.
How long did it take you, by the way, to implement this system?
We started that process 5 years ago, and to be honest, it's still been a learning journey for us. I shared with WeTech earlier, we're now also looking at and automating our procurement processes, as well as our HR shared service processes as well. So, the iPad POS system, to be honest, I don't remember it taking longer than a year, but I think it's more around the change management that took longer. How do you get staff, equipped and now ready to have that conversation with someone at the table rather than hiding behind, running to the cashier and sort of like taking some time with the bill and coming back again.
I actually have a story to tell on this, if you don't mind. I think when you do a technology implementation, you realize that there's always a change management aspects that people want to fall back on the old process, and you actually have to take them on the journey. And I think if you have a very senior person that reluctantly go for a journey, you do have a problem with that.
Yeah.
So if you have a top person driving that change and say, well, look, you cannot go back on to using your Excel anymore. You go straight to the system and all the analytics and data, it's right off the bat available on your mobile devices. Move on, right? Because you don't go back on and have weekend work where you have to go and churn the data on Excel. It's all in there. How do you get straight the data and apply, say, the digital experience in the enterprise level, right? So that's a change journey.
Yes. So actually on that point, just quite interestingly enough, we also implemented what we call a biometric system for time and attendance. So I think 5 years ago, that was still quite new to the market, where you don't do your Excel rostering formats to take time and attendance, and you just clock in based on your biometric. But today, we're still having some issues, in terms of managing the change, because your managers still fall back to, let me just send you my roster. Let's not, rely on the biometric, So, there's still that patchwork that still needs to be done.
Well, at least you can no longer have situations where colleagues clock in for their colleagues, unless they take their fingers to work. So, Yen, obviously...
I think, if we continue on the food example, I think where we're moving towards is a redefinition of the experience as well. Whoever calls a travel agent these days, we're just so used to jumping on and sort of going to our bookings. And at our office at OUE downtown, just around the corner, there's a salad vending machine, and there's a vending machine for hot meals, and you sort of go, well, maybe I prefer to be served by a person in a proper sit-down restaurant, and there are lots of places for that, but the experience and the expectation of experience is also changing. So I think from an HR perspective, the alignment with the business objectives and how that pulls through into the strategy and then what you actually then execute and how you actually use that technology becomes really, really critical.
Okay, but WeTech also made an important point for you, Suyen, and that is that it has to be driven from the top. How many of the people who you deal with through the Human Capital Leadership Institute actually embody that sort of top-down leadership and driving the change throughout their organizations? Or can I suggest that this is why you still exist?
Very provocative. When you look at the leaders that we deal with, and we work with leaders across a broad spectrum, from the very senior boards all the way down to middle level and young leaders, clearly at the senior level, there's a very acute sense that disruption is upon every single industry and that change is mandatory, right? So there's a very clear understanding, awareness of that. I think where it becomes much more difficult is a bit of what WeTech was saying, is how do you butt up against your existing legacy businesses? It's so much easier for a brand new company without any legacy to actually come in and disrupt because they don't have anything to deal with. But when you're dealing with a business that says, I get 90% of my revenue and profits from doing X, and now you're telling me to put my efforts into this thing, which is not going to pay off for another 3 to 5 years, potentially trading off some of my business today, that's a very, very difficult decision to make. But at the same time, I would say that that's really where leaders are focused on, is how do you actually drive that disruption through the organization? Otherwise, they will perish.
And Miguel, you have some pointers on that, because that drive isn't completed with a few emails from the CEO's desk. is
Yeah, absolutely. And well, first of all, I think it's no secret that the media industry is an industry that's actually rife with the disruption.
You mean it's collapsing?
No. It's evolving, Mark. And you know, I'm not even gonna, just from everybody's experience in the room, I'm not even gonna ask how many people the last time you have watched television, linear television.
No, let's ask that question.
And not Netflix and not your illegal streaming Korean TV series.
Nervous laughs in the
from
room
there.
about the illegal part.
Yeah.
I mean, it's as interested as you are with the audience, like who's
Yes.
watched TV?
Just a quick show of hands, and by the way,
last week.
ladies and gentlemen from the media, you can't vote in this. Watch TV recently? In the last month? Watch TV?
TV like
than
broadcast or
Netflix,
cable, okay?
Broadcast or cable?
Channel News Asia.
Oh, it's still.
Channel News Asia?
Talk Gold,
Okay, good. Aren't you glad that you asked the question?
You see, have
But
audience.
Wait, hang on, but the only the next logical question is what is the median age of the room, right?
However,
That's
I
below
guess
the
the
belt,
point
I think.
is the point is that clearly there are people who, as Suyen was saying, who embrace the disruption, who even lead the disruption, and then there are those who wait for it to happen to them.
Now, one of the challenges we have as an organization is that a good chunk of our staff is made up of people who have been in the same company, you know, for the last 20, 25 years, right? So, you know, forget other industries, like the same company, and many people have been working in this company since they graduated. So it's kind of like they know the one thing, right? They have the one profession, and all of a sudden, you have all of this disruption in the industry where you have to teach news people, for example, new skills. And so what you can't have is the guy who works in the graphics department who says, well, I only know Photoshop and that's all I know. Because now you've got a newsroom situation where, you know, if a news person attends an event like this, he's not only required to sit there, do his write-up, put it into the computer, and then that's the end of his job. He has to think about, okay, how does this look on a Facebook page? How does this look as a short video bite that we will put on, you know, push out on LinkedIn? How does this translate into like a proper full-length media clip that you know that goes out on our own website, etc. So, kind of forcing people to migrate from old habits into this new kind of really transmedia type of content creation is a real struggle. One of the programs that I'm responsible for running within MediaCorp is driving digital marketing competency or digital marketing capability. And I always say that even though my title is marketing, my job is transformation because it's really about building capability across the organization. So one of the programs we elected to run is a very intensive online digital marketing course, which is designed by Google, called Squared Online. And this is an intensive, you know, 20-week course, right? So it's about 7-8 hours of dedication a month from an employee. And there's exams, and there's group work, and there's all kinds of things in order to be able to go through it. So it's not easy, right? And you know, to your point earlier, one of the things that has allowed the program to be successful is that we had people at the senior leadership level, senior vice presidents, executive vice presidents, be the first to be part of the course, right? So these are guys at the senior level putting in the 20 weeks of time and going through the exams just like everybody else. So that then kind of drives everybody else to adopt, you know, adapt to the change, right?
You know,
But hang on, just because the senior leaders do it doesn't mean that then percolates down. How
No.
do you get people, even at the bottom, to say, I really want to do this? What's the secret recipe?
Yeah, so one of the key things here, and I guess this is where I'm coming about as a media person to this discussion, is a lot of what really drives a successful transformation is culture. And there's a lot of, when it comes to transformation, there's a lot of emphasis, obviously, on things like technologies or processes or even organizational changes. But very often, the culture part is neglected. And where culture comes from is the company's ability to communicate and trickle down a sense of purpose, right? So a sense of purpose is where real motivation to innovate comes from. I mean, yes, you have incentive programs and all of these things, and that may drive retention, but what really drives innovation and a self-disruptive kind of thinking is for people to buy into why, the whys and the urgency of why all of this needs to happen.
Right. So Yen, you wanted to jump in?
I think if I'm trying to make the intersection between transformation and leadership, one of the things that I find very interesting is that many senior leaders understand and look at this issue in a very cerebral way. So you can analyze this to death, right? And you can say, well, strategically to do A, B, C, and so forth. But at the end of the day, the personal transformation is very difficult because a lot of leaders think, well, this is something that happens to somebody else, right? Somebody else has to transform. And you kind of go, well, how many of you don't have a LinkedIn profile? Surprisingly large number, and it's 2017. So if you think about how you actually drive that transformation, it has to start from the person. And how is your job going to change? It's not somebody else's job that's going to change, but every single person's. What is it that you're changing that's going to be possibly digitized away, that could be done differently?
I just wanted to add once again that if you have questions, please feel free to raise your hand and ask them. Don't just make this a conversation among us. We want you to be engaged as well. We take you're nodding vigorously because you're still thinking about implementing
No, I'm just
iPads.
thinking that a continuation from what Miguel was saying about culture, I actually think that to me, the way I think about it, it cannot be just cerebral. It cannot be just the mind. It's almost an action and a feel, right? So the way I put it, it's you got to put some fire in the heart. Sometimes you do have to put some fire in the rear or butt. It kind of rhymed. So I really think that you do have to inspire them with a vision of where you want to go. They can see that the journey is not just for the leadership, the company, but it's for the individual as well. And then Alvin Toffler's quote comes to mind. The illiterate of the 21st century are not those that cannot read, write, but those that cannot learn, unlearn, relearn. So we need to teach people how to learn first and foremost before we teach them what we want them to learn. Because that's a huge switch from feeding them with content and whatever to the fact that they can now learn and stand on their own. So, okay, come back to the fire in the heart. That's about a vision where they can go aligned to the company's overall objective of why we are here in the first place. If they see that, they will continue to develop themselves as an individual. That's very key. The second part, I think, is that you do need to then have structure to rate on training, on how they're performing against the overall objective. And that's really a fire in the rear, so to speak. Right?
So Merle, how does this play out in practice in the F&B industry, which is so service intensive? Are your staff ready to learn, unlearn, relearn? And also, is this culture that you need to infuse the organization with any different from previous cultural changes that you might have had to bring about?
I think really that to pivot from that sort of, from the traditional model to a new model, a lot of it rests around the mindset shifts. So, I talk about it being an open mindset and over ownership. So a mindset of ownership amongst the employees and at all levels, not just starting with the leaders, but also at the employees level to get them to have that sense of ownership and co-creating that solution for the future. And P for pursuit of, that passionate pursuit of deepening skills and expertise, and that can only come from self. If you cannot unlearn if you don't have that desire to pursue skills deepening. And E for entrepreneurial. So that mindset of rapid prototyping. We live in a world that's rapidly changing. Today, the technology of today is going to shift and disrupt our industries very quickly. And we were just talking about the fact that, in 9 months to a year, you're doing a lot more than you would in about, say, the same 10 years. So the reality is that you need to have that rapid prototyping approach. And that, lo and behold, we take a lot of the feedback that comes from the ground. We have what we call idea labs that sort of take ideas that come from the people and solutions and actually work them into something that we can actually co-create with, all right, to solve a pressing business issue. So the last is network, which is N. So network is about understanding that you're not just an individual silo. For the entire organization to actually get that sense of partnering with the different divisions, the different departments in order to make it work. So I think it's all in all, it's an open mindset that helps to create that, and HR comes in to help to facilitate that open mindset. So it's not just about throwing content through learning and development. L&D is great, and I'm a huge supporter of L&D. But L&D's main mission is to change mindsets, right? So a lot of it is around how do you create new employee behaviors and new minds coming from new mindsets. So that's
Can I
yeah.
just get you to repeat that acronym again for those who were trying to
Open.
work very hard
So-
to write it down?
So it's open, O for ownership, a mindset of ownership, P for pursuit, pursuit of expertise and skills deepening, E for entrepreneurial mindset, so and N for network. So understanding the value of partnership, the sum is greater.
Now, David, you've been listening to all of this conversation intensely. Obviously, the first question I need to ask you is, does it really take 18 weeks, a year to implement these technology solutions? And what have your customers told you about how difficult that EQ aspect is compared to the IT aspect?
Well, I think there's been a whole number of fascinating angles that have come through all the discussions, right? But I think one thing that I heard everyone sharing was disruption in some manner or form. So MIT comes out with an annual survey asking a very broad range of global industries, will your industry be disrupted in some manner or form? So the most recent answer that came out of that survey was 90% of companies surveyed said they will be facing disruption, okay? So if you are going to be facing disruption in any industry, the first thing that we believe companies need to do is disrupt themselves internally, okay? So how can you face a changing, agile, aggressive, competitive, changing marketplace if you're stuck in the old ways of doing things, okay? So technology is not the answer, it is a great enabler, okay? Technology is the platform which must have the change management, which we were discussing on top of that, must have the top-down leadership and ownership to make it work. But we think that there is an amazing opportunity now. We get asked the question a lot, Mark, what is the future of work? What is going to change? And I was at a conference yesterday in Australia where a customer of ours, Qantas, with 42,000 employees, has just gone live on Workday with a total transformation that took 9 months, okay? Unheard of in the traditional on-premise legacy industry. But cloud is a great enabler. It enables those sorts of things to happen. So it is now not looking years ahead. Transformation is a continuous journey. The technology is available. Cloud enables huge flexibility and agility, and we can work with our customers on this ongoing journey, Mark. So, but the last point I'll just raise is that in terms of the future of work, which we keep getting asked, I mean, you've got disruption is prevalent. You've got millennials that are driving new demands in terms of the way that they want to work. There was a recent survey where millennials were saying 7 months is a great example of loyalty, okay? And then I want to do something different, right? So we're facing crowdsourcing in terms of bringing people together. All these things are creating a fascinating environment in which industries have to adapt and work, and your industry in particular, with a lot of contingent workers, part-timers, etc., engagement, empowerment, etc., is absolutely critical, I'm sure, to the success.
And I'm certain, too, that you can't revert to Excel for rostering aircrew on Qantas jets, which is clearly why that change has to happen. But let's be honest. We all like to use the word disruption because it makes us sound smart. But disruption by definition is painful, right? That relearning, the unlearning and relearning that you talked about, WeTech, is so hard work. I've already got all of these things to do, and then I have to talk to my boss, and then I have to attend these meetings, and now you want me to unlearn and relearn at the same time? How do we overcome the pain of this and actually make people want to, as Miguel said, want to do it?
I'll give you an example. About 3 years back, some of you might know that I like to draw, so on weekends I go out and sketch with the Urban Sketchers Singapore. Go look them up. I went to visit an old artist in Singapore, and we were just looking at his gorgeous 50 years of drawings. Singapore River, willow trees, and all the bungboats and stuff. We're talking about how to hold the pencil. And when I show him how I held the pencil, he said, "That's wrong." I fell on my chair after 4 years of holding a pencil and says, "Well, the way you do it is lightly, like chopstick, right? You can pick very fine stuff with chopstick with very light touch. But yet, you will need to feel the feedback on the paper when you draw so that you can get a straight line, because the pen itself doesn't give you feedback. So your little pinky finger gives you that feedback that you need when you draw, from little circle to, and the way you bend your body. So it's a rhythm that's according to the shape of your body too, in some ways. So all those things need to be relearned if you really want to learn how to draw. It's a fundamental, from the foundation of holding the pencil.
So you unlearned 40 years of holding, and you relearned the 90-year version of holding. Is that about right?
So the point is that everything that we do, actually, if we take a second to rethink and learn from the experts, to have a mentor that can guide us, to relook at things, we have a great chance of relearning something.
Can I add something here? So
Sure.
this is another aspect. So far we've talked about how introducing new technology creates tension and creates stress, right? But there's the other side of that, which is once technology and new practices have been adopted, then everybody kind of accepts it as regular. And if you change environments, as you change companies, for example, and suddenly you're deprived of that, then people actually miss it. So, and David's going to like this because this is a Workday example. So the last company I worked for was a Workday customer, and all of a sudden, you join a new company, and then you go, well, we have to apply for leave with paper, or like you have to submit.
Where's the paper?
You have to submit claims through a Dropbox, like a physical Dropbox.
So that was MediaCorp when you arrived?
Yes, but we're working on it. Okay, we're working on it.
So there must be a stationary box somewhere with all the different forms,
There
right?
is, in fact.
Oh.
So when they said there's the box, and I'm like, they're like, you don't mean a real box, right? And they're like, yeah, it's on the 9th floor, and I'm like, oh damn.
So you got to get there
But
quickly.
Mark, in Singapore is just, I think, a great example. You read all the time about reskilling, retooling, skills uplift programs, etc., right? So Singapore is almost like a country incubator, understands this, drives this, and gets this.
The national culture rather than a corporate one, you mean?
Exactly, but from a customer-driven point of view, in our Workday community, learning is so critical in terms of our system development. From onboarding, inbuilt tools for certification, ongoing certification, learning that's interactive. And you would have seen that demand. It's a huge part of what we do now.
Can I put it to you, though? Hang on. Can I put it to you that national culture is not really there yet? Right?
I think it's getting there
and without
very,
wanting
very
to
quickly.
without
I
wanting
think
to point
Sue
out the
Yen's the
people
person
who
to ask.
still like to order with the wait staff, as opposed to
That's not fair.
it is, as I was saying earlier, it is actually really hard. And if I'm looking for things, if you're looking for things that you can do tomorrow to go down this journey of the culture that you talked about, leading from the top, unlearning, relearning, there has to be something else. There have to be other people who you bring on board to make this work. It can't be a one-person job, right?
Yeah, I was just gonna add to that we've talked a lot about sort of, I like to use this analogy a lot, and it's about the, human anatomy. So you've got the brain as sort of the nerves, and the brain as formulating the strategy for the entire organization, and you've got the entire the bones, which is the organization's structural framework that you've got in place to enable it. But I think the most important that we sometimes may forget is actually that the culture is the heart of the organization. So in the midst of all of that change and the transformation, all this good stuff, very cerebral and very good, right? And you've got all the right structures in place, but without the heart, the pulse, and it keeps the energy and the pulse of the organization, you won't be able to enact change. And so to that question about how do you shift mindsets and all that, to go out to your employees and say, we've got to change, in order not to be disrupted, that's not going to work. They will hear it, yes, but it won't sit. So a lot of it's also around, how we do it, so selecting the right sort of ambassadors. So the mid-level, who are your managers that you can count on that understand the journey and are able to take people with them, to share it with people and help people shift their mindsets. So the old way is not going to work. This is the new way going forward. And we're just at the beginning, implementing some of these changes with the organization.
The heart is big, but the brain is still small.
And I think it's about coherence, because I think in a lot of organizations, the bones are not being realigned in the right way. So for example, and I don't think this is specific to Singapore or to Asia, but in fact I think you see this around the world, which is a lot of organization and HR structures are still designed for a different era. So when you talk about 7 months being loyalty, most HR and organization structures are not set up that way to deal with this new reality. In the same way, when you talk about disruption and the need to bring together networks and collaboration, it's a lot more messy. It's not the rigid structures with the traditional hierarchical org charts that we all like to draw of nice little boxes everywhere. It looks much more like a jungle gym, right, in terms of everything being sort of intertwined. But many organization structures and HR processes are not there.
Hang on. 7 months, you're willing to accept 7 months as loyalty? Rather than make the HR department change, why can't we change people so that for them 7 months is not enough?
I don't think it's a black or white or binary. If you think about how fast business models are changing and the shelf life of a company in the Fortune 500 that has dropped from something like 60 years in the 1960s to today about 15 years, it is a reality that things are cycling through a lot faster.
I wonder whether transformation can actually, and the sorts of new services and applying for leave online and all of those things can actually help to increase loyalty. Because while I do have some sympathy that there needs to be an evolution in HR departments, I think if you're a business owner, you're very worried about the fact that you have to cycle through staff every 7 months. Am I right? We don't really want to have to hire and go through that process of re-interviewing and all of that all over again. Can transformation play a role in weaning the millennials off this idea that they have to change jobs twice a year?
So I have a point of view on that. So very often, transformation is led by new blood, right? It's frequently what companies will do is they will hire people from outside of the industry, bring them into the organization. And since we're using biology analogies, and I've heard this 3 times in my career, your job is to come into our organization and we want you to be the virus that will infect the rest of the organization, right? And your department will be the virus that spreads throughout and therefore change everything. Now, the problem with the virus analogy is that if you know anything about biology, as soon as a virus enters an organism, what is the one thing every cell in that organism starts to do?
Attack it.
They will do everything they can to kill the virus, right?
It's a correct analogy.
That's just nature, right? I mean, and so the question is then, how do you ensure that the virus becomes stronger than the antibodies, right? So we talked about it a little bit earlier.
Sorry, what's the answer to that? How do you make it stronger?
I'm trying to come to it. And I think the answer is that it has to come from the top of the organization. There has to be a very, very strong leadership that does 2 things. One is that it has to, you still need this narrative, right? There has to be a narrative that then aligns and brings everybody around a single sense of purpose. And that's where leadership has to be good at things like storytelling and good at things about sharing values and making sure that those ideologies cascade throughout the organization. The second thing is also leadership by example. So I talked earlier about how we have members of the leadership team who have gone through this 20-week, intensive educational course to serve as an example to everybody else, and therefore nobody has an excuse to say, "Oh, I'm too busy to do it." And it's like, well, if she can do it, then so can you, right? So, but part of that leadership by example is also demonstrating trust. If you're driving innovation, you have to have an environment where people are not afraid to take risks. You cannot have innovation when the business environment or the culture in the company is such that if you make a mistake, your head gets chopped off, right? So you have to be able to demonstrate trust. And there are many ways in which a company can do this, but I'll just show you one example of how MediaCorp does this. And it's a very, very simple example of how, in order to drive a culture of risk-taking, we demonstrate as a management team that we are putting enormous trust in our staff. So we have what we call a Twitter rotation curation program. So the official MediaCorp Twitter account @MediaCorp, you could look it up right now. Every week for the last 4 months running now, we hand over the 100% control of the Twitter account to a random staff member. I mean, not random, but to an individual staff member. And that person can literally tweet whatever the hell she wants, or whatever the hell he wants. Now, I ask you, would you be willing to put the entire social media reputation of your company literally in the hands of like one employee, even if it's for only a week? And every week there's a new one that we do, right? So that for me is one of the biggest demonstrations we have that, look, we're on this journey together, and as a management team, we are putting trust in employees to take risks, right?
Can't wait for you to hire Donald Trump.
Oh,
We've got 20 minutes. Any questions at this
Can I
point?
just add, because you asked the question about sort of millennials, the changing workforce, their demands, loyalty. Well, what are they asking for? They're asking for engagement and empowerment. Okay, 75% of all information gained these days comes off a mobile phone from an average of 5 apps. Okay, so the new workforce wants everything mobile. Okay, they don't want to go and, as you said, fill in a piece of paper for leave. They want to know where opportunities are. They want to know what's happening with their team. All that information is empowerment that goes back to the individual. That then allows the CHRO and that to lift to be far more strategic than purely that old traditional transactional type CHRO role used to be before this new industry wave and disruption has come about.
Do we have any questions? Now's the time to ask. Any comments? Any defenses of the old ways of doing things? Well, how do you deal with this in your business when the loyalty is 7 months? Is that an accurate reflection of your business too? And
No, actually.
no?
And
3 months.
Well, no. I think we've been fairly fortunate with our full-time sort of employees. A lot of them actually have been with us for quite a good number of years. So we're looking at average of, we've been around for about 12 years now. You'd be surprised that quite a number of them are around just gave out quite a number of long service awards for 8 years. 6 years and 5 years. So I think it's been a really good, I think testimony to a lot of the efforts that we take in employee engagement. But just touching on the point of future of work, right? I mean, we've talked about technology disrupting jobs and potentially redefining jobs. So the question really is, the assumptions that we held about 7 months being too short, what were they based on? Were they based on a world that was, that took you quite some time before you gained competence in a level of job? What kind of job was that? So I think relooking at what we call, what those assumptions were is fundamental. And then we also talk a lot about the flexi work and the gig economy, independent workers. So if there is a whole group of them today, how do you engage these workers? And they could very well be your 7-month, 1-year contractors,
those?
right?
Exactly.
You have those?
And we do have those. So I think when we started that, a lot of it was thinking around, okay, and if they're going to move in and out quite fluidly, the question is, how do you create that bond with the organization? How do you make sure that they understand the culture of the organization, what we stand for, what we don't, what about our values? And we've just also embarked along the lines of our orientation program, really getting that a lot more robust, because we define that as actually one of the critical junctures. So, whether you're a part-timer, contingent worker, or a full-timer, coming on board, you should have the same consistent employee experience starting from day one. Everyone gets inculcated with the same values, knows what the group stands for and what it's all about. So that's a sort of non-negotiable. So defining what those non-negotiables are, I think is really what we would stand for. So then you can talk about engaging your contingent workers, and then you can relook at all the other, which kind of jobs should they take and what should they not. Because if it's a critical role, 7 months is not going to cut it, then it's not going to cut it.
Yeah, and I don't think it's to say that sort of 7 months is that good or bad, but I think it's about understanding the reality. I think it's impossible to think about the future of work without thinking about the future of life, because the reality is that the half-life of a skill, some averages put it at around 5 years. So that's one, in terms of you talk about reskilling and learning lots of different things. While at the same time, our average lifespan is going up to, babies being born today will easily live to 100. So when we talk about future of work, you can't decouple from the future of life. And that's one of the reasons why you start thinking about people who are floating in and out, taking time off to learn a new skill, get a new degree over the course of their time. Take up different projects in and out. And so when you think about the entire rhythm changing, that whole rhythm is very different than the post-industrial model that I think, again, many organization structures and in whole industries are structured around.
I just have a thoughts around change management, and I think this is quite important for me. As a leader of the company, what I try to do is to focus on the motivation of the individual in the context of change, and I try to address it from the point is, as adult, we are intrinsically motivated. As a child, you have parents, you got teachers who can externally motivate you to do certain things, get your exam pass or whatever it is. But as an adult, you really need to find that spark inside and have that motivation to drive change. So as a leader, I try to give that spark whenever we talk about the direction of the company, the direction of how it's aligned to the individual, the different teams, and how they could be shaping up their career in the short term, in the long term, how it all looks like. And that is really a part of the strategy of saying, how do I impart a bit of spark in the motivation so that they can then be motivated to change, to want to change, to take action to change, basically.
And how easy is it to do that? What do you do, or what do you suggest we do in the next 5 years to bring about that spark?
There's plenty of action you can take, but I think it starts with the discussion on motivation. And I think the people process technology then comes in play, because I think at the strategic level is motivation. Then the company or the organization needs to support with the learning program, with the technology to make it easy, mobile first, with data to understand them better so that it is more, the right sort of training, and there's a whole bunch of stuff you actually need to do. But my view is that people process technology is aligned to the fundamental change direction. It comes back to the purpose of the organization, but you cannot avoid motivating the individual, because that's the basic foundation of the organization.
Earlier we were talking about how changes like this are easier when they're new companies, right? Because you have less legacy to work with. In the same way, when you're talking about hiring young people, the same people that we consider, less loyal, the millennials who we consider less loyal. But the good thing about working with younger people is that they don't have the same hang-ups about acquiring new skills, right? They don't have this whole concept of unlearn what you have learned. Sorry, that's not Alvin Toffler, that's Yoda. Is not an alien concept to them, because it's just they pick up skills just kind of normally. And so I think to some degree, unlike a more traditional type of company where the younger people tend to be the subservient ones, and it's the older generation that tend to do all the thinking, the heavy lifting. Companies need to start to learn and create environments where they actually learn from the younger people in the organization. So one of the things that we do, and Instagram was an example, is that we drive social media literacy as part of what we do in the organization. And what does that mean? In a typical, I think especially Singapore company, people tend to shy away from social media. And I think the reason why employees tend to shy away from social media is because they actually believe that if they're too active in social media, my boss will think that I'm looking for a new job. And so this is kind of like the mindset that a lot of people have. So we're encouraging people to do the opposite. It's like we want to celebrate your social media profile. We want to make you the stars of our own social media, right? So if you look at MediaCorp's Instagram account, you'll find over 60 profiles of individual employees that we've taken pictures of and told their life stories about, and shared, and they become very much part of the messaging. And this is, at the same time, how also as an organization we are able to attract new talent, right? Exactly the kind of talent that we want to be able to bring this new kind of thinking to the organization.
So you're just giving me an idea. So as a CEO, I will run a LinkedIn upgrade program for everybody, right? And then if they are the stars, then the company will be a star, right? So
we gave so many people trouble for the fact that they haven't, they have inactive LinkedIn profiles. And I'm like,
excellent idea.
Really?
What's wrong with you?
Do they get into more trouble for having an inactive LinkedIn profile, or for having a too active social life in the pub?
That's Facebook.
On Facebook.
Yeah. And by the way, there are probably still companies that block LinkedIn and Facebook from access in their within their companies, right? So again, this is kind of flipping it around. The way a company should think about an employee who's active in social media should not be that that person obviously doesn't have enough to do, or that person is too is obviously focused on trying to find another job or anything. You should be thinking about it in terms of that person is a great spokesperson and a great, somebody that will attract other people into our organization, attract the right kind of talent to our organization.
David, you wanted to chime in?
I was going to say, well, at Workday, as they're both Workday customers, we encourage everyone to use those Facebook and LinkedIn, etc. But one thing which is sort of an industry-driven demand for us is, I mentioned that personalization with the employee experience we're talking about. So we've just announced an employee portal which not only contains all the Workday information that they need, but even life goals, third-party feeds, all that consumer-grade look and feel that the new era of workforce is used to and demanding. We're doing that. The other point I wanted to raise, and I keep thinking of the body analogy. I thought that was a great one, and the heart, right? So we had our European user conference about 2 weeks ago. And in Europe, Lena Nair is the CHRO of Unilever, so a global Workday customer, 400,000 employees. And she said the most important thing, they're experimenting with all sorts of artificial intelligence and chat bots and all these sorts of things, and it's creating quite a lot of angst and unsettlement and questions about what's the future and what's my role. She said the most important thing with the HR function within Unilever is the heart. It's putting the human back into human resources, and that was absolutely key, and that sort of transgresses a number of things we spoke about: change management, the heart of the organization, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. If you have a chance, it's on the Workday blog site, and you can watch the video of her insights there.
Okay, TV commercial over. Yes, we have a question. Hang on a sec, the microphone coming to you.
In sequence of what the speakers were saying.
Could you just tell us your name?
I'm sorry, my name is Elena. It is really interesting to see the new generations, the new skill sets. Of course, they're very much engaged in the social media. Give them technology, they thrive with technology. But when it comes with the social skills, it's absolutely a nightmare. I just had to deal with one example this morning before I joined. A brilliant mind, but a headache when it comes to deal with the colleagues or line managers or above and below and whatever. But very, very poor. How can we engage these kind of people as well? Because again, the heart is important, not only for HR, but everybody else in the organization.
So Jan, would you like to?
Well, I think one of the things that is important for leaders as well as for organizations is to actually be quite clear about setting what the expectations of behaviors are. And we've been talking a bit about values, and every organization is different, so I don't think there are, there's the one set of right values. It may be that sometimes it's not a good fit with a particular organization.
So that hasn't really changed, compared to maybe 30 years ago, right?
Indeed. Because I think some of these human dimensions are timeless. At the end of the day, we're human beings. But I also would say that it's very dangerous to generalize, to basically say that, therefore everybody in this particular demographic has this kind of characteristic. Because I think throughout time, you've had baby boomers who are motivated and baby boomers who are slackers. You had Gen Y who were slackers and Gen Y that were motivated. I think the same is equally true for millennials, whether it's social skills or level of motivation. So I think it's really important to make sure that there's an alignment between what the individual wants against what the company's expecting. And if it's not a good fit, then it's probably better for everybody to move on to something else.
But I do have some sympathy for your question too. After all, who would have hired Albert Einstein? The guy wasn't much good at things, as his teacher famously said, and he kept poking his tongue out with that wild hair. However, and this is, I guess, brings us to the culmination of this conversation. At the end of the day, the buck has to stop somewhere, and I mean that quite literally. Singapore, we know, human resources are really the only resources we have. And for a while, for many companies, making transformation pay is a commercial imperative. As a country, making this work is an existential imperative. And the issue that Lena raised is simply that, we were all great in the 1970s and the 1980s when it revolved around manufacturing. But precisely because it's all about services now, precisely because the human element, as we've been talking about for the last 55 minutes, is much more important than the technology. Let's call them the hands of the body. It's precisely because that's the case that Lena's problem is probably much greater, or is much more amplified now than it might have been in the 1970s, where you could have swapped out one worker bee for another. And so the question is, I guess, in two parts. One, are managers these days equipped to deal with headache geniuses, like the one that you were seemingly alluding to? And two, do we have a national culture that's willing to embrace talking nicely to patrons in a restaurant who are now ordering on iPad? Do we have a national culture that has that give and take that's so required of a country's economy that is grounded in human resources? Su-Yan, I know this is an easy question, so you first.
Yes, very, very, very easy. So you had several parts to your question. I think if you look at, I think cultures evolve, national cultures evolve as well, and you can look at over time what's deemed acceptable, even in a European culture, that has changed over time. So does the Singapore culture also need to evolve, and is it evolving? Yes, I actually think it is. Do we have a little bit more way to go? There always is a little bit of way to go, because we're never really at the finishing line. I would say, though, that for me, it still comes down to, at the individual and personal level, what is that change that we each are willing to make? I'm not sure how long each of us in this room think we're going to live. If you've worked for 20 years and we think we're going to live till we're 80, what's the next 20 years? And what is that transformation that we each individually have to make in ourselves for that next leg? And that, to me, is the missing part that I see very often in the leaders that we work with.
That they don't ask themselves that question.
The personal question around how they personally are going to transition and transform themselves. If you can think that through and change your own mindset, then you have the ability to transform the rest of the organization.
So before we come to you, Mil, what about that commercial payoff, the country's payoff?
No, actually I agree it's an existential question for the nation to a large extent, actually. I think very much aligned to what Sun is saying, if every one of us think about architecting our own development, I call it adult learning, right? So if we architect our own adult learning, then we have a shot at it. Because I think that's really the spark we need to put in all our employees, every individuals in the nation, because the world is changing faster. The rate of change is faster. And we really need to be able to get this handle on learning new stuff at a faster rate. So it's that, constantly thinking about what's the learning process that I need to go through. So I need to architect and re-architecting that process constantly. So that's really the thoughts I want to leave there.
Well, sorry to jump in.
So I think for that, I'm taking it down to a little bit more micro level. I think it's also about, shifting mindsets is never easy, right? So the questions around, we can't talk about it in a vacuum. If people, you don't know what you don't know. So, you will only be able to shift if you experience something different. So I think, for example, at Lo & Behold, we place a huge emphasis on what we call our experience program. Our employees get an opportunity, if they go to any establishment in the world, if they travel for personal holidays, they get an allowance to go to any establishment to experience the entire experience, the guest experience for themselves as a guest. So you take back some of the learnings as well. So if you went to so I just came back from Melbourne, had some great experiences in a lot of the restaurants there, and you take back some of that experience, right? So I walked into a restaurant, he asked me, are you celebrating something today? And I said, oh, wow, that's just a simple one question. And she got a lot out of me because, it was my anniversary, and then, we got a really nice treat after that. But it was thank you. But what I'm saying is, essentially, people don't know what they don't know. And I think HR has a role as that learning partner, as a culture champion, to champion some of these initiatives in a bit more creative ways. To say that you learn, just by, route learning and saying you go and attend a course and then you experience that and maybe come back and change your mindset, right? I don't think it happens that way. A lot of our generation is also about learning through experience. So how do you enable that? How do you get them to think about picking pieces of bite-sized little tidbits of learning here and there in every experience that they encounter? So I think it's a lot around.
And Mark, from a Singapore perspective, so I've been fortunate to live in Singapore for 23 years, and it's been fascinating watching the constant change that Singapore has gone through. and now this Singapore initiative of the Smart Nation, which is underway, I mean, that will be and is beginning to be very successful. But if the Smart Nation is getting the hardware in place, which is a whole range of technologies which are very, very exciting, the software is the smart workforce, okay? And that transition, you can see it taking place now in some leading Singapore-based companies. There are still a lot of laggards. But if there's any country in the world that I think can make a very aggressive, successful transition, it is Singapore. And I think we're already starting to see that.
On that note, ladies and gentlemen, we're now going to look at that other part of the human anatomy, and that is your stomachs. Lunch will be served in the Bunny room next door in a few moments. Before you leap, and obviously you're welcome to continue the conversation over lunch, would you please join me in thanking our panelists? Wong Su Yen, Miguel Bernas, Architect Mel Chen, and David Hope. A gentle reminder to please use the QR code scanner to add your contribution by completing the couple of questions in the survey. And you can access that survey through the QR code on the back. Make sure you show the completed window in your phone to the registration counter to get your $50 Uniqlo voucher, as well as a parking voucher if you need one. If you are going to post photos on Instagram from today, or you're going to tweet or Facebook about it, or put something on LinkedIn, please make sure you use the hashtag #WDay. We will now continue the conversation next door.